Welcome to Crisis in Perception, where we examine the systems shaping our world, one book at a time.
So, today we're tackling a massive question, one that gets right to the heart of power. How do systems of absolute belief, whether they're religious or political, actually build and keep their authority? To dig into this, we're going to use the work of Christopher Hitchens, not as gospel, but more like a lens, a way to see the hidden machinery at play.
Okay, so here's our game plan. We'll deconstruct this in 6 parts. We'll kick things off with the anti-totalitarian lens Hitchens used. Then we'll get into the anatomy of authority and the machinery of control. After that, we'll map the whole thing out and see how these patterns show up today. And finally, we'll wrap up by rethinking what belief, authority, and freedom really mean when you look at them this way.
All right, first up, to really get a handle on a system, you've got to understand the perspective you're using to look at it. And for Hitchens, that perspective, well, it was shaped by a really specific kind of intellectual battle. So Hitchens saw this really important split happening in left-wing thought. On one side, you've got what he called the anti-imperialist left. Their main focus is pushing back against Western power, sometimes even siding with groups just because they're anti-West. But then on the other side, you have the anti-totalitarian left, and their deal is opposing any kind of absolute, unaccountable power. It doesn't matter where it comes from. For Hitchens, this wasn't just some think tank debate. It was the fundamental choice. And getting this difference is the key to his whole way of thinking. And as you can see from this quote, he made his choice very clear. He always came down on the anti-totalitarian side. He saw this as the most radical, the most revolutionary position you could take. It's this one consistent principle that let him analyze the architecture of power itself, whether he was looking at a church, a dictatorship, or even a political party. Okay, so how is authority actually built from the ground up? Let's dive into that in our next section, where we'll look at the nuts and bolts these systems use to grab and hold on to power. The very first building block, it's all about controlling the language. I mean, think about it. It's a brilliant strategic move. If you write your most sacred texts in a language most people can't read, like Latin was for the medieval church, you create a bottleneck. Suddenly, all that divine knowledge has to pass through a very specific group of interpreters. And just like that, they become the gatekeepers of truth. And this is where you can see the system's design in action. It's just so clever. Look at the flow here. You start with the design, an inaccessible sacred text. That creates a huge incentive for a special class of clergy to guard their exclusive access to knowledge. And what's the outcome? Power gets centralized. It becomes unchallengeable. This isn't divine magic, it's a technology of control. And we have a perfect historical example of this. The King James Bible. You know, its creation wasn't just about translating scripture so everyone could read it. Nope. It was a deeply political move. By creating a single, authorized version, the English monarchy basically fused its own power with God's authority. It stabilized the throne by taking control of the narrative. Okay, so you've built the authority. Now, how do you keep it? This next part is all about the active tools and mechanisms these systems use to keep things stable and handle anyone who steps out of line. Another critical tool in the toolbox is the claim to absolute moral certainty. This isn't just a philosophical stance, it's a weapon. As soon as a system says it has a monopoly on what's right and wrong, the game totally changes. If you disagree, you're not just having a debate anymore. You're a heretic, a rebel. And Hitchens really pushes us to look at the track record, to see what happens when these systems get total, unchecked power. He says that when you combine absolute moral certainty with the power of the state, you get what he famously called an offer that people could not refuse. At that point, it's not about persuasion anymore. It's all about coercion. And then there's what we can call narrative management. This is a big one. It's what happens when institutions, especially the media, kind of flip their role. Instead of being a watchdog that challenges power, they start acting like PR managers for it, carefully choosing words, using euphemisms, and leaving things out to shape the story they want to tell. Hitchens points to this really clear example. After a car bomb plot was stopped in London, he noticed how the big news outlets were practically tying themselves in knots to avoid talking about the attackers' stated religious motives. Instead, they kept talking in vague terms about sociological problems. He saw this as a deliberate choice, an act of narrative management to dodge a much tougher, more controversial conversation. So, we've looked at the individual pieces. Now let's put it all together. We're going to actually map out the entire system and see how all these parts click together to create this self-sustaining machine of control.
So how do we map this thing? Well, we can break it down into 5 key parts: the actors running the show, the incentives that make them tick, the narratives that give them cover, the tools they use to stay in charge, and the feedback loops that keep the whole thing running.
First, the actors. These are the key players. And it's not just the obvious ones, like religious leaders or dictators. It's also the media outlets that repeat the official story, and even the intellectuals who give it a veneer of academic respectability.
So what's driving all these actors? Well, the incentives are usually pretty straightforward: keep their authority, shield themselves from criticism, and control the story that everyone hears.
And George Orwell, man, he just nailed the feedback loop that makes these systems so hard to break. The public performance of loyalty, the forced cheering, the giant posters, it isn't just a symptom of power. It's what feeds it. It's this totally chilling paradox. The act of faking belief can actually deafen people into genuinely believing, which only makes the system stronger, even if deep down they hate it.
But look, this isn't just ancient history. This model, these patterns, they pop up over and over again, even today. Let's take a look at a more recent example. Here, Hitchens is talking about the Danish cartoon controversy, and he argued that when you saw media outlets refusing to show the cartoons, it wasn't about respect or sensitivity. The real reason was fear. A small but very loud, very threatening group was able to, as he puts it, outvote the entire Western tradition of free expression. And this points to a pattern that just keeps repeating itself. You have an absolutist group that applies pressure, and what happens? Major institutions, media, universities, you name it, they often react by censoring themselves to avoid conflict. It's a predictable outcome baked right into the system's design. And frankly, it's pretty chilling. So, after all that, what's the big takeaway? Looking at things through this systems lens really forces us to reconsider what we mean by these huge concepts: belief, authority, and freedom. It really does force a big reevaluation. First, you're pushed to see belief not just as a personal thing, but as an organized system with its own rules and controls. Second, you start to see authority not as some natural right, but as a man-made technology, a tool designed to make people obey. And that brings us to the most important shift of all. Doubt isn't a bad thing. When you're up against an absolute system, skepticism becomes a kind of civic duty. It's the necessary friction that keeps the machine from just running over everything. And so, in the end, this whole analysis leads us right back to one tough, unavoidable question. If these systems of control are so well designed and so persistent, what is the real price we have to pay for intellectual freedom? This analysis is based on the collected works of Christopher Hitchens. We encourage you to read his books or borrow them from your local library. This project is free and publicly accessible. If you'd like to support the time, tools, and research behind crisis in perception, you can become a supporter on Patreon. For a shorter visual overview of this topic, see the mini explainer linked in the description. If you enjoy this kind of systems-level analysis, please like, subscribe, and comment with books or topics you'd like us to explore next.